Hello and welcome to the podcast. Now we're taking a break from the news this week and thought we might stand back and look not at the way individual incidents are reported, as in Gaza and the Ukraine, for example, but at the way those conflicts are presented more generally to the public. There are, of course, allegations that the BBC is in favour of this and that and biased one way or t'other, but are we missing something deeper? Consider this quote about the United Kingdom. The growing power of the military and the militarist coalition has been hidden in plain sight. It comes from a newly published book by Paul Dixon, who is Professor of Politics and International Relations and teaches at the University of Leicester and Queen Mary College, University of London. His book is called The Militarisation of British Democracy, the Iraq and Afghan Wars, and the Rise of Authoritarianism. So, have public service broadcasters missed a fundamental change taking place? Indeed, have I been unknowingly manipulated? I spoke to the author recently. Professor Dixon, welcome to the podcast. This book that you've written is part of a series of critical military studies. What is the series trying to do?
I think the series is trying to suggest that the debate around the military and around military matters tends to be dominated by people who have often connections to the military or accept a quite sympathetic military-dominated narrative. And so the idea of this series is to give voice to those who take a more critical approach.
I think you identify yourself at the beginning of your book, The Militarisation of British Democracy, the Iraq Wars and the Role of Authoritarianism. You identify yourself as a left realist.
Yes.
What is a left realist?
So realism is a category within politics that emphasises the importance of what exists rather than what we would like to see. And realism is usually associated with the political right, but there are some on the political left who think that realist thought is very useful for understanding politics and the performances of politics. So like Machiavelli drew attention to appearances in politics. And so someone like me would come along and look at the political theatre and try and understand what the constraints are that are operating on political actors. So, for example, in the case of Britain, I would perceive a kind of militarised patriotism as dominating political debate, and that makes it difficult for even politicians who might be sceptical or critical of the dominance of the military in Britain. It makes it difficult for them to be critical because they know that the audience is whipped up by militarised patriotism and will not take easily to a narrative that's critical of the military.
But you say you're not just realist, you say you're a left realist. Why the left? Why not just realist?
Because realism's often associated with the political right, and unlike some scholars, I think it's important for me to be open about my political affiliations and also to argue that realism is something that people on the political left can utilise as a way of understanding the world and trying to find the best way for making changes to that world.
But there's a danger, isn't it? If you call yourself a left realist as opposed to a realist, there'll be a section of society who would say, oh, well, look, he's just a lefty. Or he's a pacifist, actually hiding under some sort of cloak. I mean, are you a pacifist?
No, I'm not a pacifist, but I'm sympathetic to pacifist arguments. So although I do think that violence is necessary on occasion in limited circumstances, I find pacifist arguments about the appalling nature of war and its brutality highly persuasive. And so when it comes to the advocacy and use of violence, I'm very sceptical. And I think that's justified by the outcomes of the Iraq, Afghan, Libyan and Ukraine war, where it's possible to look for peaceful, negotiated solutions. I think that's a really good idea.
Well, one of the things that surprised me about the book is not that you analyse this, what you've just done, effectively the power of the military, but you say this, you refer rather to this, the growing power of the military and the militarist coalition has been hidden in plain sight. Leave the hidden in plain sight. The growing power, I mean, some people would say, actually, let's look at defence spending as a proportion of GDP. There it is up in the 50s, near 7 to 8%. Come back, 20 years ago, it's near 4%. Now it's 2.2, 2.3%, and we're all struggling to get up to 2.5%. So if this is the growing, if you like, power of militarism, this is very strange. They haven't persuaded the Exchequer to fund it.
What I do in the book is I define militarism, and I suggest that it exists across a number of different levels, so that a decrease of military spending can be made up for example, by a culture that is highly sympathetic to the military.
But if a culture is highly sympathetic to the military, as it would be highly sympathetic to the NHS, why would successive governments be seeking peace dividends, as, for example, the Cameron government did, and cutting defence as a measure of public spending? Those two things don't fit together.
This is because militarism is measured across a range of indicators. And David Cameron's a good example, because David Cameron was looking to cut defence expenditure after the highs of the Iraq and Afghan Wars. He was also facing criticism from the military, whether on or off the record. And he had that famous outburst where he said, "You do the fighting and I'll do the talking," because he was concerned about the military backing him into a corner in the same way that they had backed Gordon Brown into a corner. So a crude relationship between rising military spending or lowering military spending and the power of the military is not necessarily as clear as that, because there are multiple levels of influence.
But you talk about the growing power, and you say the militarisation of British democracy exposes the power of the military elite and their allies in driving the nation to war and militarising British democracy. You're suggesting British democracy is militarised or on its way to being militarised?
Well, I think, as the historical sketch in the book illustrates, that the military has always been a powerful influence within the British state, and its power rises and wanes over time. So, for example, after the First World War, the military were largely discredited by their involvement in the slaughter of the Somme and the mass losses of World War I. So the military's power waned, despite the fact that Britain had this enormous empire and required a substantial military. So the power of the military within the state, I think, has always been there. It's the degree to which it's publicly exposed or not that is important.
And whether it's growing. Here's another, because that is the claim that you make.
Sure.
And here's another quote from you. You say, the militarisation of British democracy is a left realist critique of the militarist coalition, which at its heart advocates a militarist realist ideology to justify permanent war and the militarisation of British and other democracies. So you're suggesting that there's a sort of a conspiracy, in a sense, for permanent war and for the militarisation of Britain. Now, a lot of people will think that, is an exaggeration when you look at the nature of Vladimir Putin, what he's doing in Ukraine, what his other activities around the world, his spies in this country, the worries of energy security, about food security, and so on. A lot of people will think what you're suggesting is slightly paranoid, isn't it? I mean, you're confusing a genuine defence capability to defend national interests, and national interests do exist. I mean, food, energy, and those things, with what you think is a sort of generalised conspiracy. With whom? I mean, I can't quite get that. Tell me why I should believe it.
Yeah, so what I describe is a militarist coalition, and that's not a conspiracy. That is a coalition of different groups within society who coalesce around support for war. So famously, President Eisenhower talked about a military-industrial complex because he was concerned that there was a relationship there between the growing power of the military within the United States and an industrial complex that complemented it, and that was corrupting US politics, but also the broader culture within the United States, and that was becoming...
But it's one thing to accept that analysis, and of course it would be absurd not to say there's a massive interest in the defence industries, in defence sales, and of course anybody who joined the armed forces at some point hopes to fight. So they're all, there are those natural tendencies, but there are countervailing pressures in society to take that into account. But you're making the case about the growing power of militarisation, which is the one that's surprised me. Not the analysis that there are very significant sections of society dependent on defence, that there are a large number of people who want interventionism, and that's sometimes on the left and sometimes on the right, but there is a growing power and that there's a militarisation of British and other democracies. Are we really more militarised than we were 40, 60 years ago?
That's a really important point. And what I'm arguing is that since 9/11, and because of 9/11 and the global war on terror, that was used as a justification to allow the militarisation and the mobilisation of military forces that resulted in the Afghanistan and Iraq wars. And what I try and do in the book is show the evidence that draws on the Chilcot inquiry.
That was the Chilcot inquiry into the Iraq war, which was extremely critical, obviously, of the then government, Tony Blair government, which took us into that war, yeah.
That's right. It was highly critical of Tony Blair, but what wasn't noticed and what Max Hastings drew attention to, Deborah Haynes from The Times did, and Mark Urban from the BBC, they drew attention to the role of the military and its power in lobbying and enthusing and, in my argument, manipulating for Britain's maximum military involvement in the invasion of Iraq. And I would argue that that was not because Iraq represented an imminent threat to the UK or its citizens in Cyprus, but because it was in the organisational interest of the army to maximise its involvement in the invasion of Iraq. And that maximisation wasn't necessary to appease the Americans. The Americans were happy with a more symbolic approach, and even Tony Blair wanted a more limited British deployment in Iraq. But it was the army who stood to lose out if they weren't included in a substantive way, who lobbied and manipulated Britain's greater involvement.
I mean, I have talked to somebody who was in the... 2 days ago, somebody who was in some of these internal discussions, and they said at a low, not at a ministerial, slightly lower level, but in number 10, and was saying that actually they didn't know of a member of the armed forces who supported or were happy about the invasion of Iraq because they were deeply worried about it. So I don't disagree with you that there'd be key people in the hierarchy, but to suggest who were in favour of it. But there are a lot of people within the armed forces who had a great deal of reservations. And I think when you go back in history, you can think, relatively recent history, you can think of this coalition being, significantly fragmented, we say. If you go back to Suez, it's a long way, 56. There, Lord Louis Mountbatten, who was chief, I think, of the defence staff at the time, offered his resignation before Suez because he thought it was wrong. So there you have the highest soldier, and a member of the royal family, of course, saying, this is wrong, you must not do it. When you look at a number of other occasions, I remember, for example, in terms of the Falklands just before, relatively hard right people like Nicholas Ridley, suggesting that we actually do a negotiation with Argentina. You remember during the Falklands War, the Foreign Secretary, Francis Pimkin, trying again there desperately to find some sort of non-military solution. So all the way through, you can find, at the very least, a fragmented approach. But your book suggests us it's a coordinated, almost conspiracy between at the highest level, and perhaps that's overstating it, isn't it, in the light of what I've just said?
Well, to argue that something's a coalition, again, doesn't mean that that's a conspiracy. It's different groups who have an interest in promoting war and militarisation because it's in their economic interests or their ideological interests. And this is not to dispute that there aren't differences within the army itself. In the chapter on Iraq, I point to the Iraq and the Afghan factions within the leadership of the army who are in conflict over whether Britain should stay in Iraq and finish the job or whether it should redeploy to Afghanistan, which some in the military elite believed was a more winnable war. And then Simon Akin's drawn attention to even divisions within sections of the army, within companies, in their different attitudes to operations on the ground. And infamously, there are severe differences between the Navy and the RAF and the Army at that elite level, who are pursuing the interests of their particular service rather than necessarily.
Oh, well, that's undoubtedly true. I mean, I remember talking to Dennis Healy when he was Chancellor, and a long time ago, and he'd been Defence Secretary, almost tearing his hair out about the way in which the three armed services used to fight each other. And, to get in a common view is incredible. The Navy wanted the aircraft carrier, the Army wanted X-tanks, and the Air Force wanted the latest planes, and nobody wanted to think about what we actually needed to do in terms of defence. And that continues today, I agree with you. But, I mean, I remember going to Northern Ireland, finding the Army after the initial involvement in Northern Ireland, being briefed by a man called Brigadier Glover, who was head of Army Intelligence. Yeah. And it was quite clear, this would be 1979, 78, 79, quite clear that the Army thought the situation was unwinnable, was extremely in Northern Ireland. Glover said it specifically, the IRA can't win, but we can't win. We can contain the violence, but that's all we can do. We certainly can't destroy it. There has to be a political solution. You had the Labour minister, then for Northern, who'd been Defence Secretary, but Lord Down saying to Roy Mason was gung-ho, we can win, and so on. So actually you had the military being far more sophisticated in some ways, in terms of their understanding about the need for political solutions, than the politicians. It's all a bit, that's why I found that a bit more complicated. I find those debates going on, and high critical, Field Marshal Lord Carver, for example, at one time, Chief of the Defence Staff, not wanting the renewal of Trident. Because it was thought it was basically not quite a waste of resources. So the other thing I want to pick up with you, just before we talk about the broadcasters and what they don't ask us as much as what they do, is this statement in your book. The anti-war movement was vindicated by its opposition to the Iraq, Afghan, Libyan and Syrian wars. And also, it would appear, the Ukraine and Gaza wars. Could I ask you about the Ukraine wars? In what way is the anti-war movement vindicated by the Ukraine war?
Well, when it comes to the Ukraine, I think what would be argued is that the anti-war movement is right in its belief that it's very important to avoid the use of force. And on Ukraine, from the very start, there have been voices that have argued for a negotiated end to that war. And some people have argued that within about 6 weeks of the war starting, that in Turkey there was a possibility of a negotiated settlement.
Well, there's always a possibility of a negotiated settlement, and because, I don't want to go about Second World War and Hitler, whatever, then over Czech and Poles or whatever. You could always negotiate if you hand to the aggressor some of what they want, and perhaps you keep a bit that they want you.
Yes.
But when you look at this Ukraine, you're looking at an invasion by Russia of the Crimea, in 2014. You're looking at this present aggression, whatever you think about it. It's very difficult to believe that the present leadership in Russia wishes to negotiate anything other than either the complete conquest of Ukraine or very significant elements of what was Ukraine. Now, you might be in favour of peace, you might be in favour of negotiations, but that's only possible if the other side or sides will negotiate. I'm just surprised because a lot of people will agree with you on Iraq. A lot of people might be very worried about what happened in Afghanistan. A lot of people will agree with you about the Libyan intervention actually creating chaos. I'm not sure about the Syria war are involved in that. But a lot of people will look at Ukraine and think, this is a limit. You are faced in the world, unfortunately, with irrational dictators who will use whatever power is at their disposal to have their way. And if you wish to oppose that, you are inevitably drawn into alliances and some sort of military opposition, as well as being open to negotiation. So again, your statement that the anti-war movement was vindicated by its opposition to X, and also it would appear to the Ukraine and Gaza wars, I think it will surprise a lot of people and will say, actually, what you are arguing here would ultimately result in us not having armed forces which could be deployed in the last resort against people like Vladimir Putin.
Yeah, people will try and argue that. But as I've said before...
Is it true?
I'm not a pacifist, and I do think that force is necessary on occasions. I guess I'd just take you back to the global war on terror. And often the way that war is justified is through raising fears, as were raised during the global war on terror, about Al-Qaeda, about the Taliban, that these represent an imminent threat to the UK. Fear is generated in order to justify these wars. And with the new Cold War emerging against China and Russia, I suppose people who are in the anti-war movement are concerned that the demonisation of enemies leads logically to a militarisation and empowering those very forces who are likely to use military rather than diplomatic and other means.
But do you think we are demonising Vladimir Putin?
I think that the path to war is more complicated than a simple kind of either-or choice in terms of what actually happened. And there are realists who argued against the expansion of NATO going back to the 1990s. There are arguments that there was a deal on the table prior to the war in 2022, that Zelensky was elected as a peace candidate and he was seeking to move towards that peace agreement, but there were forces within Ukrainian society and forces in the West that were advising him against that.
But it wasn't him who invaded. I mean, was it?
No, of course not. And the invasion is a terrible atrocity and reprehensible and certainly counterproductive in terms of what Vladimir Putin hoped to achieve. It's not about saying that Putin is a great guy and these are the terrible people. I think, as we've discussed, that in political and historical situations, the realities are far more complex than that. And unless we acknowledge the complexities of those realities, that we're unlikely to reach situations where you can negotiate settlements. You talked about Northern Ireland, for example, where the IRA carried out an appalling campaign of violence, as did other groups in Northern Ireland. But it was only by the de-escalation of that war that the IRA and their political wing Sinn Féin were seen as legitimate negotiators of a peace process that has been highly successful. You could look at South Africa as well.
Yeah, there are a number of other reasons, of course, military exhaustion, the penetration of the IRA by the security services, etc., etc. But anyway, let's not go there. Let's pick up that point you've made about the complexity not being, if you like, the coverage not being sufficiently complex. And you do, in the book, identify, obviously, certain parts of the media which are, well, what I call just gung-ho, I don't know what you would call it. But anyway, Daily Telegraph, The Mail, to a degree, The Times and others, who are instinctively, I think you seem to suggest, sympathetic to the militarist position that you talk about, which, of course, raises a big question about broadcaster, some would say state broadcaster, slightly misleading terms, like the BBC, and what its role should be. And I have my experience in the past has been working inside the BBC is, yes, when we've gone to war at any time, it's extremely difficult to try and get alternative voices heard. Once that's undoubtedly been the case, you could point to many examples of it. But do you think at the present time you detect, as you detect a growing militarisation, genuinely in the public discourse, or do you detect in the BBC a reluctance to provide the space for the complexity of arguments you want to see?
What I can go back to, Roger, is the evidence in the book. And what I did was I had the luxury as an academic to go back and look at key instances where there were moral panics generated about Selly Oak Hospital, or the parades at Abingdon, or alleged abuses of soldiers in Leatherhead Leisure Centre, and show that there was a lack of substance to a lot of those stories that were used to promote the militarisation of the UK. And what I found in looking back was that there wasn't very much analysis of those moral panics to get to the bottom of actually what was going on and whether there was real substance to these panics. And it's only with...
Now, hold on. No, that doesn't lead you on to conspiracy. That could, if you wish to, take you to analysis about the nature of tabloid journalism in particular, or the nature of sensational journalism, and the appetite of the audience for it. You go one step further by saying, actually, that's part of a conscious attempt to move public opinion in a certain direction. That's what you're arguing, aren't you?
The degree to which it's conscious or unconscious is, as you'll know, it's very difficult to know someone's mind, and people who are consciously trying to manipulate public opinion and propagandize it are the last people to say, actually, what we're doing here is propaganda. What they're trying to do is to make it look like these events or panics are normal, natural events to which they are responding with the outrage that is legitimate. And I guess my point would be is that the broader media culture in Britain at that time did not investigate these panics and try and get to the bottom of it.
And you think this is a continuing or worsening problem? It's not an historical problem, simply, as you suggest.
Well, again, in the book, I mention an incident in June 2021 where the Royal Navy sent a ship towards the Crimea. It happened to have a Daily Mail and a BBC journalist on board, and it sailed close to Russian waters, and Russians sent jets. And we saw that there was a leak of documents, or not a leak, someone at the MOD left some papers at a bus stop. And so we found out that this was part of kind of the manufacturing of militarism, to dramatise to the British public that Russia is a threat to the West, and also that our aircraft carriers that were going through the Mediterranean had money legitimately spent on them, and this was a good use of British taxpayers' money.
Oh, I'm sure that that's true. What you don't talk about is the fact that, for example, the Russian jets continually test our air defences coming over from the north, and, we have to scramble. This is a game that's going on, unfortunately, we used to go on between the Soviet Union and the West now, Russia and whatever, testing defences. And indeed, we also know, for example, that Russia has been cutting cables in the Baltic, and we also know about fairly heavy, as they all do, fairly heavy spy level in this country and so on. The legitimate one is about energy security, a legitimate one is about food security and so on. I think what some people would say you are describing is, a natural tendency of the armed forces to draw attention to what they're doing and promote what they're doing, which, of course they should do that in their own terms, but to then allege that there is a wider conspiracy, if you like, as opposed to people who are naturally more sympathetic to that view and perspective, is the bit I find difficult. And then the other I find difficult is your suggestion that it's growing. Again, going back to where I began, there were significant reduction in defence spending and other things like that. And as we would see it, the resurgence, or some would see it, the resurgence of Russian imperialism, and then that seems to be what Putin is doing, and certainly he keeps talking about this, 12th, 13th century justification for the historical connection between Russia, etc., etc. This is not militarism is not a growing problem. The world has got darker in many ways. The military need to respond to that in some ways. That's far from saying that there is a militarist conspiracy and that it's growing.
Okay, again, Roger, I never use the word conspiracy once in the book. What I'm talking about is a coalition. Now, do people conspire in the sense of...
Okay, I agree. Sorry, forgive me. And you're right, you don't. But you do talk about the militarisation of British democracy, exposing the power of the military elite. And you do talk about the military elite favoured the maximisation of this, that and t'other. And you talk about the militarisation of British democracy. Okay, not a conspiracy, but you do suggest the whole tenor of your book is that we are relatively unaware of this and that we ought to open our eyes. So if it's not a conspiracy, it's a remarkably successful, in your view, organisation, not just of society, but also of public discourse, to fail to see what is happening.
If we look at the Chilcot Report, for example, and we look at the reporting of the Chilcot Report, there were three people, Max Hastings, Mark Urban and Deborah Haynes, who I found actually mention the role of the military in maximising Britain's role in the Iraq and Afghan wars. The fact that this is not part of a broader debate where people understand that, as we've discussed, that the Army, the Navy, the Air Force have organisational interests in increasing defence expenditure and in promoting themselves to the broader society.
Well, of course that's the case, but the Army or Navy would say, look, if we're going to go into Afghanistan, if our political leaders take that decision, yeah, we want a proper role here. And actually the argument in Iraq was because we didn't have a role in the post-war implementation, it went to pieces. And they find a number of Brits saying, highly critical of the way the Americans dealt with Iraq, eliminating government structures effectively. So, it's one thing to say, if it's going to happen and our political leaders have decided that we're going to go there and we want a proper role, and it's entirely, proper for them to say, we think we are underfunded for what is being asked of us. And there's been this perpetual debate, that as long as I can remember, between the Foreign Office making promises and the MOD saying, Ella, you've made the promise, but we can't fulfill it. I remember discussions about whether we should intervene in the Balkans, in Kosovo. Large numbers of the military saying, hold on, if you're going to put troops in there, our boys in there, how are you going to get them out? And a fierce argument in the Ministry of Defence. So what you seem to me to be describing is an entirely natural situation in which the political decisions tend to come first, and the military tend to say, if you're going to do that, fine, that's our job, we go and do it, but hold on, this is how we need to do it. That, I would say, was natural tension, but you maintain actually the politicians, and you talk about turning player in your book, for example, are effectively almost steered into conflict because of the interests of the military and the defence industries and so on.
Yeah, I don't think it's controversial to suggest that the Westminster model of government that people tend to have in their minds, that the Prime Minister and the government are in control of what happens in the state, that is flawed, and that there are powerful forces outside of government and within the state that influence what the government actually does. And within the book, I provide evidence from not just Great Britain, but the United States about the power of the military within Britain and the United States to manipulate the political agenda and to back politicians into corners. So I'm not saying Blair decides and the military implement. What I'm saying is that the process is more complicated than that. And what I do argue is that, based on Chilcott's evidence, is that the military manipulate Britain into maximum military involvement, not only in the Iraq War, but even when that's going wrong, they then seek the next war in Afghanistan, bait the government with a peace operation when they actually are going to carry out a war in Afghanistan and undermine the policy of the government to do peace building in Helmand province. So what I'm trying to draw attention to is the power within the states of the military and other groups to shape policy. And that was not only apparent in Britain, but also in the United States, and I'd argue in Canada and in the Netherlands, who deployed into southern Afghanistan with British troops.
Well, it's a very stimulating book indeed, a very controversial one, and very deserving of much wider debate than I've been able to organise with you. But thank you very much indeed for talking to us, Professor Paul Dixon.
Thank you for having me on.
Our thanks to Professor Paul Dixon, whose book, The Militarisation of British Democracy, is published by the University of Edinburgh as part of its Critical Military Studies series. And you can find a link to it in the description of this programme. Now, if you'd like to support us, you can do so for less than the price of a cup of coffee. Just head to patreon.com/BeebWatch and sign up for £1.99 a month. You'll also receive my weekly blog where I share some reflections on the week's interview. And that's all for this week. The podcast is presented by me, Roger Bolton, and is produced by Kate Dixon, with sound by Dave Kitto, and special thanks to Quinn Genty. It's a good egg production. Until next time, goodbye.